This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Jewelry can say many things on your wedding day. As a wedding band, it can say, "This is a forever symbol of our forever love." As a gift to your wedding party, it can say, "Thanks for standing up there with us." Blue Nile can help you find the piece that says it all and says it beautifully, with expert guidance and a wide assortment of jewelry of the highest quality at the best price. Go to BlueNile.com and experience the convenience of shopping Blue Nile, the original online jeweler since 1999. That's BlueNile.com.
Hello, Dan Saladino here with an edition featuring many of my favourite things. Cooking, eating, singing, but most of all, food stories from around the world. And I hope you enjoy listening to this edition as much as I enjoyed making it. In this edition, stories of food and music.
The song is called Merci Bon Dieu, and it's about being thankful for a good harvest. The rain is falling, the corn is growing, and all the children are eating, so let's dance. Our Father up in heaven says our misery is over. Merci bon Dieu, gardez comme la mise a fini pour nous.
We're returning to an event called Taste the World, which has become an essential feature of the WOMAD Festival. Here, leading artists from around the world do what they do best, play instruments and sing songs. But because this music stage doubles as a kitchen, they also choose a dish which they'll cook in front of an audience.
We're going to start with fire. We're making a sauce. This is like the base for the sauce.
In the case of Layla McCallum, who'd travelled from New Orleans, she sang songs that drew on her Haitian heritage. And during the gaps in between, she cooked up a pot of Louisiana shrimp.
This is really funny. I've joked so many times about having my own cooking show. So this is really surreal. Sometimes you get what you ask for.
My name's Annie Menter, and I dreamed up the idea of Taste the World stage at WOMAD festivals.
I'm Roger DeWolf, and I'm the host and compere of Taste the World and have been since its inception.
Artists come and cook, they bring their music, they bring their culture, their experiences, their stories to the stage. They make the food, they make music, and they share the music and the food with the audience.
Over 3 days, 12 acts take part in Taste the World. This year, the locations they came from included Spain, South Korea, Mexico, Tibet, Vietnam, Estonia, and Naples.
Only for this dish, we use smoked mozzarella. Oh. Okay, only for you, we give you a little time.
I'm fascinated by what it's not. It's not a chat show. It's not a cookery demonstration. It's not a musical performance. And yet it is all of those things and more. And at the end of it, people feel like they've been in someone's kitchen for the afternoon.
We put everything in the oil, and when potatoes start to a little bit cook, put the pasta.
At the end of each performance, a dish is served up and small portions shared with the audience.
There is food being dished up at this minute. Spring rolls have gone out. Were they good?
A lucky few who've watched and listened during the cooking, singing and storytelling get to taste the world.
It's not physical greed that motivates people. It's almost like they're taking a sacrament. It's that they've been part of this preparation. They've heard about it, they've seen it, they've smelt it. Now they want to taste it. It's a magical thing, it really is. You can see them really concentrating on the taste to top off everything else they've heard and seen. It's a terribly powerful package.
It is an extraordinary thing. It's quite an extraordinary thing.
This got me thinking about a deceptively simple question. How is it possible for people to tell a story of who they are and where they're from through a single plate of food? Why is it that the artist from Tibet cooked dumplings and the Estonians served up buckwheat? Why did the Neapolitans choose a pasta dish and the Brazilian musician use okra? When and why did these dishes become such powerful symbols of identity? We're going to hear some answers from the Taste the World stage. And I think there's another important question we need to ask. In our increasingly globalised world in which cultures are blurring and more of the world appears to be consuming similar things, from food to fashion, film to music, is the connection between food and place fading away? Are the links between ingredients and identities becoming less and less relevant? If so, why should we care? Someone who's spent years travelling and researching, exploring these questions, is Anja von Bremzen, author of National Dish, Around the World in Search of Food, History, and the Meaning of Home.
I've been fascinated with the idea of nations and nationalism and national dishes for a very long time, ever since I wrote my first cookbook, Please to the Table, which was about the cuisines, about the different republics of what was then the Soviet Union. But the book came out in 1990, exactly as the Soviet Union fell apart. So all these different entities that were part of an empire, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Estonia, of course, Ukraine, became independent nations. And they, in real time, I was able to observe how they handled the national nation building, of which cuisines was a very important part.
And Anja, your book acts as a reminder of how recent the actual concept of a nation is itself. For centuries, if not thousands of years, other identities were far more important.
Until the concept of nations started crystallizing with the late Enlightenment, really, and after the French Revolution, yes, people thought of their identities in terms of religion. For instance, the Spanish Inquisition rooted out infidels and false converts through seeing if they would eat pork, which was forbidden for Jews and Muslims. So that was also really important. But in terms of thinking of cuisine as a national thing, I think it's something that really came into play in the late 19th century powerfully. And when identities, not just foods, but when identities became commodities.
And that question I posed of what fate awaits food and identity in a more globalised world, you argue national dishes aren't necessarily disappearing, but their role is definitely changing.
Globalization is really something that is threatening to take away our identities, because you can eat the same sushi from Tbilisi to Tokyo, have the same tacos, the same Caesar salad. At the same time as the globalization encroaches on our sense of who we are, we're becoming much more protective of our origin stories. The more we're becoming displaced spiritually and in terms of our identities, the more we cling to the stories. This is why the rise of toxic nationalism in so many countries that we have witnessed. Parts of it is, of course, very dangerous. But in terms of food, we are seeking out the so-called authentic, even though authenticity is such a complicated construct.
To illustrate just how complicated it can be, let's hear from a group which had travelled to WOMAD from Vietnam, the Saigon Soul Revival Band. They use traditional instruments, including the two-stringed banjo-looking Dan Saladino, but they also weave in Western sounds of funk and rock and soul, sounds that were influencing Vietnamese musicians in the 60s and 70s. Guitarist and Dan Saladino player Indy Laville.
The musicians back in those days that really started this whole thing, we owe a lot to them, really. It's amazing and fascinating the way they took this music and not...
From the Beatles to Jimi Hendrix.
Yeah, exactly. And they could have... I mean, some bands did sing in English, but I think what really the most striking difference is to incorporate the Vietnamese language into the music, and that's really what makes it quite special.
The reason the group is called the Saigon Soul Revival goes back to events in Vietnam in 1975.
The word to evacuate came over small walkie-talkies handed out to the leaders of pre-arranged evacuation groups.
After years of war, US troops were evacuated, and communists from the north took Saigon. As part of a process of reunification, Western music was banned. Saigon Soul Revival's lead singer is Nguyen An Minh.
We, the Vietnamese people, we will never know why those songs are banned. We just know that we cannot play it. We could not play it at that time because the government said, no, you are not allowed to play, so that means no one can sing and no one can play it. That's it.
What's fascinating is that whereas musical influences from the West were banned, Western food was not. French colonial rule had lasted between the 1860s and 1950s, leaving behind bakeries, baguettes, and banh mi sandwiches.
In terms of the influences of, at least during the French era, today, some of the most popular dishes in Vietnam, like the banh mi, Vietnamese bread sandwich, it's extremely popular. We can get it anywhere in Vietnam, in Saigon, in the north as well, or in the center. And it's one of the unique things, I think, about Vietnam compared to other countries around it, like Cambodia or Laos or Thailand, which doesn't have a strong bread and coffee culture like Vietnam has. So it's quite interesting how Vietnam is different in that way. And I guess it also ties into the music. The Vietnamese have a strong identity, but I think what's interesting about it is how they've managed to take all of these different things and make it sort of their own. So, for example, there's coffee in Vietnam, but it's a different way of brewing and drinking it than in Europe, in the Western world, in France, for example. And so is the bread that looks similar to a baguette bread, but is much smaller and...
They use rice flour.
Yeah.
To make it.
They use rice flour, that's right, yeah, to make the bread. And so yeah, there's a lot of mix in the culture, in modern Vietnamese culture, that where they've taken things from all these different influences that came to Vietnam, and I think the music is also part of that, just like the food is.
And yet, what do you make of that food and music story from Vietnam?
I thought it was absolutely fascinating, and having grown up under socialism where so many things were banned, I could definitely relate to it. So it was really interesting. And with the food, I think it's a fascinating example of how the Vietnamese took the French presence and used their own creative agency to innovate and develop new foods and customs and ideas. So, of course, colonialism, no apologies for it, but we shouldn't look at the colonized people as always these victims. They found their own creative spaces in these situations, and I think it's important to remember.
On your travels, you headed east Vietnam and took a look at the origins and fate of some of Japan's national dishes.
In Japan, I look at two national dishes which are very different, which is rice, that is seen as essentialist aspect of Japaneseness, almost sacred. And I also look at ramen, which is a Chinese borrowing, a hybrid, that became nationalized as a national dish only in the 20th century because it fueled the rebuilding boom after the Second World War. And, of course, the invention of instant ramen as a Japanese phenomenon. So it was very interesting to look at these different foods and see how they functioned. And, of course, rice, for all the promotion, for all the education in schools, that is the sacred Japanese staple, the rice consumption is going down drastically in Japan because people want to eat more globalized food, and there's so many other options. Foreign bread, for instance, French bread, and all these other different starches, Italian pastas. So it's always interesting to see how these so-called national staples that require patriotic consumerism are actually often in trouble.
Let's turn our attention to one of the global foods you've just mentioned, pasta. And at Taste the World, a dish was served up by a group from Naples called Ars Nova Napoli.
We come from Napoli, we are Ars Nova Napoli, and we try, because it's very, very difficult in only 1 hour to prepare for you. It's a very typical Napolitan food. Pasta and patate. Pasta with potato. You never tried this pasta? Nobody. This is very, very ancient, traditional dish. And we cut the potato very, 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 very small. Show the potato, please. Very small potato. We take with us from Napoli typical cheese. Parmigiano, benissimo. And we have for us the best important Napolitan thing, mozzarella. We open fire and start to play for you.
The group has been playing music together for 15 years, and it also looked as if they've been cooking together that long, because there are 6 members and everyone had a hand or a say in creating the dish on stage. What also came across is the strength of their identity as Neapolitans and their determination to keep a live music tradition going.
Tradition is very, very live because many people use folk music for party, for wedding, for this thing, yes.
This idea of Naples being one of the really important centres of music, of song, you would argue that it's also one of the most important cities in terms of food?
Yes, because for us, because it's like a religious. It's like a religion.
Yeah.
Because we have many fresh things like fish, like whatever you want, you have. And this is very, very lucky thing because it's possible it also for rich people and for poor people.
With so many possibilities, what did you choose to cook and why?
We decided to cook pasta e patate because many times when in the other nation ask which is the typical dish of Italy, everybody think to pasta. Pasta and patate for us it's must in our cook, but in the other nation it's not very famous. And for us it's very symbolic thing because it's a poor dish, but it's very, very strong and it's very, very, come si dice, complicato, difficult to cook. And it's fantastic because you mix potato, mix cheese, mix different kind of pasta.
Tamborolo, tamburello mio vennete Roma, camelan tutta una ueliuela, camelan tutta una napolitana, camelan tutta una napolitana. The patata is ready. Okay, the very, very famous thing of this pasta, and this pasta was born in the poor family. Like many kind of Italian dish. And for this reason, we use different kind of pasta because they use conserve everything. And when arrive, all the pasta mix and put in the potato. On this fantastic pizzica, arrived the moment of the pasta, please.
We live in a globalized world where you can listen to everything on Spotify. Why is it important for the last 15 years you've been keeping that sound?
Because Napoli give you this chance in the life, because it's possible from in the globalized world. It's possible to find the roots in everything, not only in the music. And this is a very, very big opportunity for us. We are very, very lucky because we live in a metropoli, in a globalized world, in a Occident nation like Italy. But we grew up in a city where it's possible to find a roots in many things, not only in the music, like in the kitchen, in the language, or in the music. If you want, you found the roots.
Arrive the fromage. Le fromage, le cheese.
Ars Nova Napoli. Anya, this is music and food from a city you know very well.
I love this story, and I love that they chose this dish because it is a lesser-known dish, but it's a very important part of the so-called cucina povera, the poor cuisine canon of Naples, that is really kind of glorifying, in this nostalgic way, the former poverty of the city, because the city is very particular. It was one of the most, the most crowded city in the 19th century. It had 10 times the urban density of Victorian London. Imagine that. And so all the staples like pizza, pasta al pomodoro, which is a better known Neapolitan pasta and patate, came out of this poverty. And of course, Naples is in a different economic position now. And but this cucina povera is really glorified. And one interesting thing is the pasta patate, it uses mixed pasta shapes, because presumably people had all these different leftover, little bits of pasta in the different packages, and then would mix them all together and mix them with another carb, another starch, the potatoes, and it became this creamy, nourishing dish. Well, now mixed pasta, the Neapolitans call it pasta mischiata, mixed pasta, comes in pretty packages as a kind of glorified piece of former poverty that is now quite expensive.
Today we think of Italian food culture as one that comes out of this intact, unchanging rural idyll, but the reality, however, is that in the 19th and early 20th century, Italy wasn't exporting food influences around the world. It was sending poor, hungry people.
It was, in fact, the largest exporter of poor, impoverished immigrants. It had, after the unification of Italy in the 1860s, the chaos and the poverty caused the largest outmigration in what was then the recorded history, as people mostly from the South went to the Americas and kind of introduced their food culture of what became unified Italy to the rest of the world, arguably before the idea of a national Italian cuisine took place at home. So it's a very, very interesting phenomenon. And when you look at actual descriptions of what people ate, now we think it was, wholesome grains and wholesome greens, and it was so wonderful. But the diet was really horrifying. It was just dark gruel or breads, soaked in water with some salt. And the reason why so many people immigrate was the lack of food.
Let's hear another example of foods moving between the old and new worlds. And for this, we need to head towards the Himalayas and the country of Bhutan, sandwiched between China, India, and Nepal. The musicians, the Bhutan balladeers, sing in a language that's almost extinct, a South Asian equivalent of Latin. They travelled to WOMAD with a producer who'd recorded this rare music with them in the mountains, Ian Brennan.
It's the highest nation on Earth, has the highest average elevation, makes it quite special. Maybe even more relevant, it is the first carbon-neutral nation on the planet Earth. And it's been mandated that 60% of the land will remain forested. And so it's quite a special place, hard to get into. You can only get into there using the national airlines because no international airlines want to fly into that airport because it's difficult.
Doing the singing and cooking simultaneously were King Zan and Zhang Mo.
Emadazi, we call it emadazi. It's our national dish. So Buddhists usually have this emadazi dish in every occasion.
And what is it?
It is chili mixed with onion, tomato, and cheese. That's our ingredients for the emadazi.
And as I discovered when I joined the cooks helping out on stage, this dish uses a lot of chili, and I mean a lot of chili.
So we have Patty here who's helping with the cooking. And I think, Patty, you actually had to check, did they really mean that much chili? You were really surprised.
Yeah, and we're actually putting in half the amount that's normally used.
Put it all in,
And yeah, I thought this was so interesting because just a few hundred years ago, potatoes, maize, tomatoes, cacao for chocolate, all ingredients that start to make their way out of the Americas and transform the way the world eats, to the extent that in remote villages in the Himalayas, another of these ingredients from the Americas, chili, becomes a central part of their food culture.
Strangely, I have quite a few Bhutanese restaurants in my neighborhood, Jackson Heights, Queens, which is where a lot of people from the Himalayas have settled. We have also lots of Tibetans and Nepalese. And so the first time I tasted the Bhutanese national dish, emadazi, it really powerfully reminded me of something Mexican because it consisted of melted cheese, which is an important part of the diet, and this green, fresh chilies. So it was like, wow. Incredible. But chilies, Bhutan was on a trade route between Tibet and India. So a lot of the ingredients from South America were introduced there quite quickly. And because it's so mountainous and it's so hard to grow things there, chilies took off and became part of the national food culture, which is also, I have to say, quite recent. Because the region is very mountainous with this very diverse traditions. And in the end of the 20th century, the government started the kind of one nation, one culture push. And also the transportation was improving, so people could travel and discover the different regions. And this is when they started to push Dzongkha, as well as English, as a national language, and emadazi as the national dish, believe it or not. So it's something quite recent.
The Bhutan balladeers singing in an ancient language and cooking a less ancient national dish. Let's stay in that region and head further north, onwards to Tibet. For more on this artist, over to Taste the World founder Annie Menter.
Yungchen Lamo was a refugee from Tibet who left Lhasa with her 6-year-old son, and she walked across the mountains down into Dar es Salaam and to the Dalai Lama. And all she could bring with her was what was in her head. She didn't have baggage, she didn't have luggage. Walking over the hills with her 6-year-old son. It was extraordinary, otherworldly, and it felt like it came from the top of a mountain.
Yes, I grew up in Tibet, and then I walked Himalaya mountains and went to India, crossed many journeys. Now I'm here, Taste of the World in England. I never thought make a momo here today.
What Yung Tang Lamo carried in her head included recipes and songs, both of which she shared on the Taste the World stage.
This is a dough, plain dough, flour mixed with water, and so there's no oil or salt, anything.
Mm-hmm. Each one of these is so beautiful. Like I said, looks like a seashell.
You have to close very well, and so that it doesn't leaking later on.
Yeah.
And this we normally say zizi momo.
Zizi momo.
Zizi means mouse. Little look like a mouse.
Oh, I see that.
This normally you cooked in the water, and you can steam, you can fry.
China's occupation of Tibet began in the 1950s, and so began waves of migration which eventually included Yung Tang Lamo. That journey she made, first to where the Dalai Lama had fled in India and then to New York, became a common one. As a result, the city is home to the largest number of Tibetans in the Western world. And Anya, with them came momos.
Right. It's interesting. Again, in our neighborhood, momos are kind of a cult. New York stages this annual momo crawl where people can go from one momo place to another and choose the best. So I'm very familiar with momos, and there are a variation of a dumpling, which is so universal. And yet it's imbued with so much national pride and identity. So many variations also. The Nepalese make them one way, the Tibetans another way, the Sherpas in a different way. And I've tasted all these regional variations, and it's incredible how much pride people take in their own different versions.
Next, a food and music story from South America. We're heading to Brazil.
Estou montado no futuro indicativo, já não corro mais perigo e nada tenho a declarar.
Claudio Cron now lives in the north of England, but he grew up on the northeast coast of Brazil.
So Bahia is bigger than France, and they have 70% of the population there are black. Nowadays mixed, many of them are mixed.
I think the story that we're mostly familiar in the West, or certainly in Europe, is the one of slavery in the American South. And yet the greatest number of enslaved Africans were in Brazil.
It was in Brazil. And Bahia is the biggest population of African people living outside Africa in one place. So there you're going to meet the Yoruba, the Swahili, the Keto, the Bantu, the Eure, the Ashantis, the Congolese, so everybody in a melting pot called Brazil. Brazil could not be the Brazil we are without the influence of the African people that brought so many different things to Brazil, and the indigenous people of Brazil that was the first people that was already there.
You had a very limited opportunity on stage to capture some of that story in a dish. Can you explain what is the dish?
Yeah, that dish was something that my mother used to cook, called muqueca.
I love the word as well, muqueca.
It's a fish dish, and I made with okra and squash and coriander and ginger, turmeric, pepper, bay leaves, salt, cumin.
And okra as well is a story of an African ingredient that finds its way into Brazilian cuisine.
To Brazil. Okra is something that you have in a lot of different dishes.
If this was almost like an industrial scale process of moving humans from one continent to another as labor, how did the food arrive?
Man, that is incredible, because it's a good question. because a lot of African people, the Afro-Brazilians, they didn't get much access to food. They used to carry seeds of different things, coffee seeds or coriander seeds. They braided the hair with the seeds inside. For example, I carry dreadlocks, and a lot of them have plaited hair. So when they arrive at certain place that they could plant, they unravel the plaits, and get the seeds from inside the hair and plant.
Because seeds would have meant survival.
Because those guys already stole their lives, so they have to do something to be able to survive.
Claudio Cron and the story of Bahia, muqueca and okra. Anya.
Yes, well, the muqueca is an classic Afro-Brazilian dish. And interestingly, the name is Tupi-Guarani, it's indigenous. And I think it's derived from the word muquem, which refers to a technique of slow cooking food over fire. So already you have this hybridity there. But of course, the African slaves brought with them crucial ingredients like coconut milk and dendé, the palm oil, that kind of this rust-colored oil that's essential in muqueca, as well as ingredients like okra. And it's interesting how a dish like muqueca, in kind of the Brazilian food mythologizing, becomes a symbol of diversity, of Portuguese influences from the colonists, of indigenous roots, of African slaves, and how these narratives, much like the narrative about feijoada, which is a Brazilian national dish of beans and different dried meats, they became this kind of idealized versions of some kind of racial democracy that supposedly exists in the country. You know, in post-colonial Brazil, they needed a narrative of racial unity and racial harmony. So there's all these stories about dishes like feijoada, muqueca, that unite all these different influences. And often these food stories obscure and kind of wipe onto the table the darker stories about slavery and colonization.
Again, reminding us of how complicated a national dish can be. For the final artists from the Taste the World stage, we're heading closer to home, to Europe, and a food story from a former part of the Soviet Union, the small Baltic nation of Estonia.
Every year when I'm researching the bands, there's reliably one person or band that I fall in love with.
Taste the World host Roger de Wolf.
This year it was the Estonian duo Root. Uncanny harmonies. Most extraordinary playing of one zither between two people. And singing at each other from a distance of about 1.5 feet. Absolutely extraordinary sound and wonderful music.
Duo Root are Anne Lisette Rebane and Katarina Kivi, as well as explaining how their contemporary music weaves in Estonian folk stories and songs of spells. They cooked a dish of mushrooms and buckwheat. And for me, this is a great illustration of how climate can shape a food culture. The further north you travel in Europe, the cooler the temperatures, and so the hardier the grains that can be grown. Grains that don't produce fluffy loaves, but instead harder and flatter breads, along with porridges.
Buckwheat is this kind of very basic thing that you can chuck like everything with it. Everything goes. Buckwheat boiled, and then a block, like a small piece of butter, is for me a considerable breakfast. And then if you feel adventurous, there was some point when every morning I also threw some pieces of cheese, like sandwich cheese on top, and then it melted into the buckwheat. Yeah, so that's, I think, buckwheat for breakfast. I've heard of some people eating it with like sweet jam. What? Yeah, which I do not understand. I think that's an abomination. Shouldn't happen.
So breakfast with buckwheat is boiled into a porridge.
Yeah, more.
It's a savoury dish.
Yeah, well, for sane people, yes. Yeah, but it's not boiled till it's like very, very soft, but it still like has some integrity.
I think it depends. I think some families boil until it's like
mushy.
Anya, you grew up in Moscow, around 600 miles to the east of Tallinn, the Estonian capital. Did that story of buckwheat resonate with you?
I was really struck that as a Russian person, I would also pick the same dish, buckwheat with mushrooms. That's something that our parents made. And it just goes to show you how geography is so important, right? There was buckwheat, there was mushrooms. Of course, Estonians would never for a million years think of it as something Russian, rightly so, because there, again, we have this post-empire, post-Soviet cuisine that is such a strong part of their identity. But it made me feel very nostalgic for this northern summers where we picked mushrooms and would eat them with buckwheat.
Stories of food, identity and national dishes remind us of how complicated their origin stories can be and why they endure. Why does this matter? An answer can be found at the end of Anya von Bremsen's book. Growing up in Moscow, the soup borscht was for her a national dish, something that became synonymous with the Soviet Union, but for most of her life, borscht was part of her Russian identity. In February 2022, the dish started taking on new meaning. Russia had begun its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and for Ukrainians, borscht somehow became a symbol of resistance. And last year, the culture of borscht cooking was added to UNESCO's list of intangible cultural heritage in need of urgent safeguarding. The food of a nation at war.
It's something that my mom made every day when I was a child. It's something that I could claim as a Russian dish just because of our deep connection to it, but it's not. We have to give it to Ukrainians because they really fought for it, and it became a symbol of resistance for Ukrainian. It united so many Ukrainians, again, over social media as this Cook for Ukraine movement. There was a very powerful idea that food are so symbolic and so important to nations, especially in difficult times when they're under assault, and how it can bring people together.
Anya von Bremsen on the meaning of a national dish and helping to explain the power of food stories. If you want to cook some of the dishes in the programme or find out more about the artists and the music featured, just go to the Food Programme website.
If there's one thing that my family and friends know me for, it's being an amazing gift giver. I owe it all to Celebrations Passport from 1-800-Flowers.com, my one-stop shopping site that has amazing gifts for every occasion. With Celebrations Passport, I get free shipping on thousands of amazing gifts. And the more gifts I give, the more perks and rewards I earn. To learn more and take your gift giving to the next level, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST.
What's up, y'all? Janice Torres here.
And I'm Austin Hankwitz.
We're the hosts of Mind the Business, Small Business Success Stories, a podcast presented by iHeartRadio's Ruby Studios and Intuit QuickBooks. Join us as we speak with small business owners about the tools they use to turn their ideas into success.
From finding that initial spark of entrepreneurship to organizing payments and invoices, we've got you covered. So follow and listen to Mind the Business, Small Business Success Stories on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you get your podcasts.